Hey, Rebecca, do you want to start? Or should I start?
As you prefer.
Okay, let me share my screen.
Do you have the list of the webinar?
Yeah. All right. Good morning from the United States. It's still quite early here and it's very, very cold in Wisconsin, but it's nice to be here with many people. This is the first of what's going to be a webinar series. We anticipate 8 that address reproductive rights in contemporary and historical economic perspective. And on behalf of Rebecca Gomez-Betancourt, Miriam Bankovsky, and myself, I would like to thank you all for being here today. Yeah. Oops. There we go. What I'd like to talk about today is Wicksell, population and procreation. So the Swedish economist and his contributions to population theory, and also sort of how it fit in with reproductive rights and reproductive rights as sort of an economic problem, right? Particularly for women in the late 1800s and early 1900s. But this is not a new thing, right? There's been a lot of news recently talking about reproductive rights in the United States. We had the recent Supreme Court decision. If you've been watching the news this last week out of Asia, there's been an endless number of stories about declining populations, right? And what Korea, Japan, or China is going to do in terms of pro-natalist policies. So indeed, since Adam Smith, J.S. Mill, economists have written on poverty remediation, the evils of inequality, and the necessity of general education as it intersected with what they called the population problem. And population policies were simply another form, right? We can look at Malthus, we can look at child's one-child policy, and in all cases, population and procreation have been linked to the economics of poverty, wages, and national economic development. This is also an important topic that intersected with a lot of the different 19th century women's rights movements. Right? In this case, economists and social reformers had identified that reproductive choice was fundamental to women's economic independence, their ability to work, the types of work that they could get, and what they would be paid. For example, right, we can look at writings by Mary Wollstonecraft, J.S. Mill, and Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Family limitation was also important, a component of improved living standards, right? And this was recognized by Malthus, by Marshall, by Pareto. And if we look ahead, right, 50 years in the post-war period, population policy and population control were central components of most economic development policies. And then if we become very contemporary, like several of the seminars that we will be hosting later in the series, recent research has demonstrated that family planning, right, including access to legal abortion, is associated with higher wages, higher family incomes, greater labor force participation rates, and expanded human capital investment. This includes work by Claudia Golden, Jonathan Gruber, and Caitlin Myers, for example. What I'd like to start with today is 3 claims that I think it's fun to go first, right? Because then you can just make claims and everyone forgets by the last seminar. But 3 claims that I think will resurface throughout the various seminars and explore them within sort of the context of Wicksell and late 19th century economics. And the first one is that the role for the economist and for economic theories and social debates is socially constructed, and it's a function of historical and current cultural context. Right. So today, economists might be told to, in English, we would say, stay in your lane. Right. So economists do economics work. Right. It is not our job to comment on social policy. That was not the case in Wicksell's time, and we'll see actually he was pushed to study economics to be a more knowledgeable commentator on population issues. The second theme is, at least in the case of Wicksell and some of the later Swedish economists, it's difficult to impossible to disentangle the economic analysis from the economic policies that they recommended. So, for example, in the case of Wicksell, he identified his policy solution, which is a stationary or declining population, well before he developed the economic theory behind it. And then third, one of the reasons why the economics of reproductive rights becomes so controversial is it exists at the intersection of personal and social choices, of micro and macroeconomics. So rational individual choices about childbearing, right, which we could argue are rooted in utility maximization, budget constraints, right, income, choices about human capital investment, labor supply, can be at odds with national policy objectives, which might want to adopt either pro-natalist or anti-natalist policies as related to poverty, economic development, factor productivity, right, GDP growth, unemployment, and welfare state policies. There's any strict methodological individualists here, we can take up whether or not there can be a social viewpoint on this. But at least for the Swedes, right, they're very much comfortable with the idea that in addition to the individual, there can be sort of a societal preference for certain sorts of policies. As I mentioned at the beginning, some of these things never change. Right, sorry, oops. On the left, we have Crisis in the Population Question, which is a Swedish bestseller in 1934, written by Alvin Gunnar Myrdal, right? And then just last week in the news, right, we have Asian population policies and what we're going to do to increase the population. So Wicksell was a Swedish economist, the late 1800s and the early 1900s. He was the leading Swedish economist of the time, the only one with a significant international reputation. He was of the same generation as David Davidson, who's a very conservative economist, and he shared the limelight most of his life with Gustav Cassel, right, who is another fairly conservative Swedish economist. Wicksell, eventually, he had a long career as a social agitator, public speaker, pamphleteer, before actually becoming an economist and securing a position at Lund University. And if you look at Wicksell's contributions to economic theory, right, they're everywhere. Marginal analysis, interest rates, money, banking, macroeconomic, business cycles, series of voting, tax rates, and of course, population. He's widely regarded as sort of the theoretical founder, the forefather of the Stockholm School, right, which include the next generation like Heckscher, Ohlin, Myrdal, Lindahl. Oops, sorry. Yeah. But of course, before Wicksell was an economist, he was also a social radical. And he wrote and lectured on issues of social justice, something he never abandoned. And you can see I've got two pictures here. One is the massive Swedish emigration to America between roughly, get my dates right, 1850 and 1910. 1.3 million Swedes emigrated from the country, including Wicksell's brother. So that was sort of like the big issue of the time. Right? Wicksell, of course, attributed the immigration to poverty, which is a central theme in all of his work. For social policies, he advocated for workers' rights, expanded access to education, confiscation and redistribution of inheritances, universal suffrage, reform of the tax system, and legal contraception. In doing so, right, the next generation of economists, they said he had a decisive influence on the evolution and political ideas in our country, said Erik Lindahl. Wicksell played a large part in the remarkable reshaping of Swedish society. Right, by the 1920s and 1930s, many of his policies were actually starting to be put into place. So late 19th century Sweden, in addition to emigration, right, poverty, emerging urbanization, emerging industrialization. And so between the immigration and falling fertility rates, Sweden starts to envision a population crisis. So between in 1820, women had roughly 5 children, and that had fallen to an average of fewer than 3 a century later. It'll decline to less than 2 by the interwar years. And so this was everyone. I was talking about this. So labor unions, social reformers, scholars, the clergy, communists, suffragists, right? It was the main topic of conversation at the time. And if you look at like Swedish intellectuals, Edward and George Brandes, Anne Margaret Holmgren, Ibsen, August Strindberg, Ellen Key, right? The population question was a problem for all of them. Actually, I don't know if you can see in the bottom right, maybe if you close your people window, there's a cartoon. Wicksell was always at the sort of the forefront of the social debates. He liked radical opinions, and he spent 3 months in prison for blasphemy. But his time in prison was fairly comfortable. And this is a newspaper cartoon that shows they're asking them to fetch the prison governor because they need a 4th to play cards with Wicksell in the evening round. But what got him into this? And in 1880, after several years of depression and sort of he had a religious crisis and he wasn't really going to classes anymore as a university student. Suddenly in 1880, he reappears and he gives a public lecture on the common causes of drunkenness and how to remove them. Right? And his central thesis was that overpopulation and poverty were the root of all of Sweden's social ills. And basically the speech was his reading of George Drysdale's take on neo-Malthusianism, right? Let's see. He says, poverty is the root cause of drunkenness for 2 reasons. First, miserable, overcrowded homes under constant financial stress, right? It's no wonder why people drink. And the second reason was, particularly for students, right, was that they're poor. The education process takes a long time. They can't get married. So what do? They drink, and then it's either celibacy or prostitution, right? So have you considered the fact that this is the only substitute that they're offered? So Wicksell says he can solve these 2 problems, right? Excess drunkenness and prostitution, if we would just adopt legal contraception. And everybody freaked out. Right. The lecture launched Wicksell as a public orator and commentator. He made his living at this for more than 10 years. He was enormously popular with the students, the labor unionists, and some of the socialists, although he was a fervent anti-Marxist. So that kind of makes his relationship with the socialists a little different. However, the conservative press, the university, which was quite conservative at the time, right, everyone was up in arms. If you look at a simple search of like Swedish databases and newspapers from the period, there's zero mentions of Wicksell in 1879, and there's more than 1,000, right, the next year in 1880. It's just sort of capture the extent to which he captured the attention of the entire country. And one woman student wrote home that said, it would be wonderful if a day or 2 could pass undisturbed by the mention of this undergraduate Wicksell. His cock has caused a sensation like of which has not been seen for many years. He arouses admiration, astonishment, loathing, and hate. And he stirs the passions of awe. The expected criticisms came pretty quickly, right? And they're really what anyone would expect, right? The immorality of contraception, that legal contraception would induce premarital and extramarital sex. It interfered with the rights of the unborn. And then there's all sorts of questionable medical beliefs, right, associated with the frequency and nature of sex. The Swedish conservatives rejected legal contraception and equal education for women, arguing that would undermine population growth, which is necessary for national prosperity, and it would threaten the existence of the Swedish state. You have to remember, right, Sweden, right, Finland was part of Russia for a lot of this time, and Finland was part of Sweden for some of this time, right, and Swedish-Russian relations were extremely fraught. all the way back to the 1700s. So the idea that Sweden could easily be overrun, right, and become an arm of Russia was very much, right, in the minds politically. And then another argument was that contraception would open the door to legal abortion. I think what's interesting, if you start to read all the arguments, is there's another piece of this, right, that we might not anticipate today, which was that Wicksell had failed to study the economics of population properly. So David Davidson, who held the chair in economics at the University of Stockholm, demanded whether Wicksell, when he wrote back as an editorial in the newspaper, he asked Wicksell, have you made yourself truly familiar with the various theoretical aspects of the population question, which in his view included addressing socialism? Davidson continues, have you made yourself acquainted with the different views on the possibility of overpopulation and the general laws of population growth? All right. Have you undertaken careful study of the foundations of these theories? Have you read Malthus, which he hadn't at this point? Have you studied Carey? Right. And the University Council actually pushed the same line in its disciplinary hearing for Wicksell. They argued that attempts to improve the lot of mankind should be based on extensive study. The Swedish Medical Association suggested he undertake moderately extensive studies in science, economics, right, which he wants to use as a point of departure. So rather than suggesting that this wasn't an economic problem, it was clearly seen as an economic problem, and it was appropriate for economists to comment, right, on population and birth control and abortion. It's just that Wicksell was criticized because he didn't have any economics background at this point in time. And in fact, he would come to study economics, although it would take another decade by way of the population question. He argued that population was the most important and at the same time the most neglected of all social problems. And so for a while, Wicksell continues, he writes pamphlets, he gives lectures on immigration, prostitution, marriage, socialism, and poverty, all of which he relates back to neo-Malthusian themes. And of course, there's a string of scandals. The public is scandalized, police interventions, angry protesters. But eventually we get to Wicksell's population theories. So over the next several years, right, he continues to get pushback that he hasn't studied economics. So Wicksell begins a program. He goes to London and he sits in on lectures. He reads Walras, Cairns, Jevons, Mill, and Smith. He travels to Lausanne and Berlin, has lectures by Brentano, Adolf Wagner, Menger, and Vienna. However, despite his exposure to a really broad range of economics at this point, his first and second professional writings were focused on population. One was for a Norwegian economics journal, and the second was submitted for a French competition. He would be pushed back away from population theories for a while in his efforts to get a job at a Swedish university. So he works on his value capital and rent and a lot of public finance work. He had to get a law degree during this time in order to be able to teach at a Swedish university, but he always returns to the population question. So his theory of population, it's a bit ad hoc, right? We get it over the course of maybe 20 years in a lot of different pieces and in a lot of different forms. Wicksell himself said one ought therefore to be informed of all the economic conditions that are related to the density of population and the means, and this means nearly all economic phenomena. So while some people have dismissed Wicksell's population work as not particularly scientific or not particularly original, there are others such as Mats Lundahl, a contemporary Swedish economist, who argues that if you take it all together, it's possible to envision Wicksell's population theory as sort of a general equilibrium analysis. Right? And of course, this is just coming to the fore, and we know Wicksell's reading Walras at this point. So it's fairly convincing. Wicksell's argument was that, at least in theory, all the variables in the economic system, including population, affected and interacted with each other. foreign trade and international factor mobility. Right? And take Sweden's mass immigration. Right? This is, of course, an interest to them. Interacted with population growth, production, factor accumulation, and factor productivity. And in fact, there's aspects of Wicksell's theory that are very close to Samuelson's specific factors approach to international trade. Anyway. Excuse me. Whereas many sought remedies for Sweden's underpopulation, right? Wicksell was convinced that the country was in fact overpopulated. And overpopulation was the leading contributor to poverty and its associated ills. Before, right, becoming an economist, right, we see that Wicksell had long argued that the social ills like poverty, drunkenness, prostitution could be mitigated, right, through contraception, legal contraception, and restricting population growth. A smaller population would improve living standards, reduce crowding, right? Prostitution would diminish if people can marry earlier, he argued. Alcoholism would decline if family life were more harmonious. So that's the social policy, right, that had been widely developed beforehand. The economics, Wicksell said, there's really two questions or two problems that should be carefully separated. The first was that there's a physical problem, right, that the human capacity and inclination to procreate will inevitably outstrip what society can reasonably support. And for that, right, you're stuck in a Malthusian dilemma. You have to make a choice. You can either reduce births or you can increase deaths. You know? The second problem was economic. Right, Wicksell says rather than asking what maximum population can be supported at minimum subsistence, instead we ought to consider what population size and density would guarantee everyone the maximum share of well-being and would thus, economically speaking, be the best. He defined the optimum population as a point where any further increase in population would be met with a decline in average individual welfare. Alternatively, he explained this would occur when the diminishing marginal productivity of labor, right? So dividing fixed capital and land resources across more people was equal to the gains of accruing from the division of labor, right? So you've got sort of this balancing act, right? In Wicksell's view, Sweden had already passed the optimum point, as evinced by declining labor productivity and increased food imports. Given the doctrine of relatively diminishing returns from agriculture when labor or capital intensity is increased, Wicksell argued it's no wonder why poverty, want, and misery have been the lot of the broad mass of the population. Ultimately, increases in population could only be sustainable when aggregate output experienced constant growth, fully matching the increase in population. However, Wicksell was pessimistic on the scope for technological or productivity improvements to achieve this kind of growth. Instead, he believed the solution lay in a stationary population, and to do this, the only rational choice was the use of voluntary measures of population control. He says there's no other choice besides the neo-Malthusian program, early marriage but few children, an average of 2 or 3 per family, and for the rest, voluntary sterility. All right, so he continued to call for legal government-sanctioned birth control, what he called some way of making conjugal relations possible without the woman becoming pregnant. So if we go back to our 3 claims here, the cartoons on the left or the right are of a Swedish doctor, Hinky Bergensen, who was also a leading advocate of birth control at the time. And I'll talk a little bit more about him in a second, but you can see how he's represented as sort of an evil guy, right? He's out trying to pawn birth control on the population. All right, so by the time we get to the 1910s and the 1915s, right, we have a more senior Wicksell, right? He's a professor of economics now. However, he was really no less radical. He believed he had an obligation to educate the public on important social issues. And he writes, right, in many different places, that his foremost duty is to educate the Swedish people and to participate in the public debates. Sometimes Bertillon would later say he would be a fantastical representative of extreme opinions, right? Just to get the opinion out there in the debates. He kind of liked playing that role. Anyway, the economist as public intellectual would become a long-standing and important tradition for Sweden, right? They did not worry that commenting on the social debates was going to compromise their scientific objectivity, right? And neither would advocating for specific policies. It was simply their job, right? And they were allowed to travel quite far afield, right, on their expertise as an economist to virtually any kind of social issue. All right, so I previously noted that policy and social recommendations for Wicksell preceded theory in this case. When the theory came, it was wholly consistent with Wicksell's longer held views on legal contraception, right? So, and then the third, right, was Wicksell's population theory itself was macroeconomic. Right, he has a number of different features to this, but it's primarily a statistical study of Swedish population changes, a mathematical representation of optimum population as a function of agricultural productivity, and an analysis between the link of population and national economic development, particularly factor growth, technological progress. However, his population policies, right, were both macro and microeconomic. He says his end goal was the greatest possible prosperity of society, individually and collectively. And he was not at all worried that his views were covered by ideology, right? Wicksell said scholars' individual sympathies and antipathies, their diverse political ideas, their conception, in a word, of the aim of practical and social economic activity, which lends its color even, right, to their treatment of theoretical questions. So he was perfectly comfortable with the fact, right, that his own personal inclinations and views of things sort of drove the questions that he was interested in as an economist. So his macroeconomic policies were population stationarity, limited population growth, and policies that would encourage greater productivity, particularly of capital. The microeconomic side of the argument is in a lot of ways much less developed for Wicksell. And however, right, he seems to find it that this argument is more persuasive for the population. So he doesn't hesitate to link frequent and unplanned childbearing with classical theories of wage determination. He argues that greater reproductive choice would positively impact women's ability to work, women's wage levels, and family income. He wanted government policies that would support better healthcare, childcare, and education. He argued that these would benefit not only families, but the nation, and investment in human capital, or quality over quantity. And actually, Wicksell's partner, Anna Bugge Wicksell, was a leading feminist and activist at the time. She also wrestled with the population question, right, often in the context related to women's rights. So the relationship between population growth, women's work, and wage levels was widely canvassed at the time by politicians, social reformers, and scholars. And there's a lot of people who claim that expanded opportunities for women's employment would reduce population growth because women's interests would be refocused outside the home. And national economic power, the existence of the Swedish state, were going to be a function of a large and growing population. Both Wickells, right, argued that greater financial security for working class women might in fact have a positive effect on population quality through a reduction in childhood mortality and childhood diseases. All right, so Wicksell, in his statistical study of population, attributed the inadequate care of children as one of the greatest contributions to childhood mortality, along with unsanitary conditions. Rather than returning to religion and traditional gender roles, both of the Wickells advocated for better education, improved living conditions, and legalized birth controls to allow families to plan their lives and children more effectively. Right? All women desire more control of their family's financial well-being, Wicksell argued. Right? But the challenges faced by working class women, widows, and single mothers were especially steep. In addition to poor labor conditions, limited employment options, and insufficient pay, frequent and unplanned childbearing had an outsized impact on their ability to earn a living. Anna Wicksell said, this is a social and political issue of great scope. People are aware that it is the seriousness of working people. This is not the ridiculous demands of women, right? She says, this is a worker's problem, right? Not a gender problem. Wicksell himself says, modern workers, like modern women, have wearied of being more or less animals, both beasts of burden and breeding stock. They want to feel they are completely human beings, right? Well, Wicksell largely avoided a discussion of abortion. In a late pamphlet, however, he concluded that it should be permitted on the same grounds of legal contraception, essentially. All right, he says this is a delicate question, right? Personally, it's only in his advanced age that he's been able to overcome the apprehension that is already the nature of the issue, even more than an inherited tradition, right, against it. So Wicksell recommended explicit criteria when abortion should be allowed. In his view, it should be allowed freely and unrestricted before the 3rd month. However, better and regular contraception was to be preferred, right, to making use of abortion as a regular means of controlling fertility. He says it should be available as a last resort, a safe guarantee for the many that absolutely need it. Where there's a conflict between the individual and the state interests, to the extent that the state has an independent interest, right, Wicksell advocated that the individual superseded the social or the national interest. This was fairly consistent with all of his politics. In particular, he was an anti-nationalist, which regularly got him into trouble, given the general Swedish view of the Russians at the time, including his wife. However, being an anti-nationalist didn't mean he was anti-statist. He had a pretty expansive view for government intervention and management of the economy. All right. So a few things that we can say here to wrap up, so we have some time for discussion. And so the world followed Wicksell, although of course not as fast as he would have liked. Right. His contributions to economics were appreciated by the next generation of Swedish economists, although it would take much longer for them to reach the international audience. Regarding social policies, the outcomes were mixed in the short run. Improvements in education and women's working conditions were balanced against other constraints. Right. So in 1910, the Swedish Parliament passed the Lex Hincke's law, right, forbidding public dissemination of information or products for legal contraception. There's a reaction to the extremely graphic public lectures that were being given by the doctor at the time. And Wicksell was so aggravated, he threatened to be the first arrested in violation. His friends managed to talk him out of it. He was getting quite old at the time. Anyway, the law remained in place until 1938. And most of Wicksell's proposals for redistribution, universal education, universal suffrage, equal women's rights had to wait for the next generation. As Alan Carlson noted, a longtime scholar of Swedish population economics, independent of the Malthusian debate, yet dealing with the broader population question, contraception remained an important issue for the women's movement into the 1940s. Liberals, social democrats, and communists united here in questions of anti-contraception and abortion laws. In the medium run, right, Wicksell established a long tradition of the economist as public intellectual in Sweden. Right? In his later years, as society moved toward his positions and he became less radical, right? He held the role of an elder statesman on issues of taxation, monetary policy, and the economic implications of war. But also on population. The next generation, Castle, Olin, Myrdal, Lindahl, right? They all followed, right, in Wicksell's footsteps in terms of their contribution to the public economic debate. Over the long run, right, Wicksell was one of the first to place population at the center of the Swedish social debates and pushed for the reforms that would underpin the Swedish welfare state. Of the next generation, right, we have Alva and Gunnar Myrdal, whose crisis in the population question changed the economic path of Sweden for more than half a century. And so the crisis without the fertility rate had now fallen to 1.76 children per woman. Right? The sense of urgency was heightened by the Great Depression and looming Second World War. The book itself was highly controversial. Right? It attributed the decline in fertility to changes in the economic role and status of women triggered by industrialization. In order to revert, right, to population growth, to counter depopulation, the Myrdals argued that you had to invest in a social welfare state focused on the needs of women and children. This book was the manifesto of the Swedish welfare state. It's a founding document of the welfare state, right? So it holds a very important point in Swedish history. And even though its recommendations differ from Wicksell, right, it really grows out of the Wickellian population tradition. However, right, one of the biggest controversies is it also set the path for Swedish eugenics policy that resulted in the sterilization of tens of thousands of people who were deemed unfit. So in this sense, the Myrdals diverged from Wickellian population in significant ways. They rejected neo-Malthusianism, the presumption of overpopulation, although they argue, right, in crisis here, that nobody in the future will question that children should be born only as a result of the free choice of their parents. The neo-Malthusian movement, in the case of Sweden, belongs to history. It is entitled to its monument, but in positive terms, it has nothing more to offer, they declare, right? And the last thing we can maybe mention is that it's of course difficult to see how Wicksell would have felt, right, about Swedish population in the 30s. He died in the 20s, right, and the Depression really changed things, as did, incipient war. However, he leaves us with one thought: Wicksell and eugenics, and he was worried that the principle of modern so-called racial hygiene, right? For my own part, he remains hesitant before these suggestions because he thought or was worried that we didn't really know enough, right, about how to identify people who shouldn't procreate to proceed at this point. All right, I think that's a good place to leave it. Thank you. Let's see if there's any comments or questions.
Who want to start? Maybe someone from the master degree or anybody else. I have some questions to start if nobody wants to start. I don't know if you can stop sharing and then we can see each other if we put in.
Oh yeah.
Gallery. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Marianne, for this presentation. To start our discussions, to start doing something that we don't have in the literature, and is the discussion among economists or in economic writings on reproductive rights. So this is a very hard work, and because we are starting, I will introduce some very simple question or general questions for the discussion. One probably is, if I understand well, do you have the impression that Wicksell didn't do like the political work, the rhetorical work, he was not so engaged to go further in the defense of the reproductive rights? So maybe what we need is more kind of leaders, as we have in the history of economics. For example, John Stuart Mill, that was in the parliament and did the political work to convince people, the rhetorical work. The second question is about the link. If you found a link between when you say in Wicksell, in the economic questions, you talk about the physical problem. You say that the human capacity to procreate and it was inevitable outstrip that the society can support. If in this argument of the physical problem, if you found something like the the nature is limited, we need to take care of the environmental things, or if is there any reflection of we need to take care of the earth, of the resource, of the natural resource, any kind of, because in United States during the progressive era, the conservationist movement, there is a link between the nature and the what here you call the physical problem. And my third question is the super complex link between contraception and abortion. If you can explain a little bit more as you can, maybe you take other questions and we collect the link when you say that in this moment contraception will open door to abortion. So what is this link? But I don't know if somebody else wants to join me on one of my questions about rhetoric or about nature or about controlled birth and abortion, or other. If you prefer to collect, feel free, please.
I would like to ask something, but I was wondering where to raise my hand. I can't find it. Sorry. Should I just go ahead? I didn't see if there's anyone else. Yeah, hi. Thanks. This was interesting. I didn't know Wicksell didn't read Malthus before, because I was always assuming that his ideas on population would derive from Malthus. I wanted just a clarification on what you said at the end on the Myrdal's position on neo-Malthusianism. Did you say they distance themselves from neo-Malthusianism? Because I would have thought the opposite. I mean, his work was very neo-Malthusian. But yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it's they're trying to build a really complicated argument, the Myrdals, that you can get population growth by also allowing universal access to contraception and full reproductive choice at the individual level. So they argue that women were disenfranchised in the move from agriculture to industrialization. So women used to have economic power on the farm, and they were co-producers in a sense, but in the shift to industrialization, women became centered in the home, and men became wage earners, which gave them sort of, all the economic power and decision making. And so they said that, well, women want, the ability to work too, and to pursue jobs and to pursue their independent interests outside the home. Right? So they're very much in that sort of mind view, but they also really wanted to achieve a growing population for Sweden. And so the way they kind of try to reconcile this is that first, if you give people the choice in childbearing, and then you help support the children, right, through education and food subsidies and clothing subsidies and housing subsidies and all these other things, you'll get better quality children. They're very big on quality. And then women might be willing to have more as well, right, than if they had to raise them on their own without the help of, the welfare state. But it's and it's the same argument they're trying to make right now, I think, in Asia, right? That if you give women more empowerment and you give families more social support, they might have more children. But at the same time, right, you want the people to have the full choice over whether they're going to have the children or not. And I don't really know if the Myrdals are successful or if anybody else is successful in sort of reconciling, right, the competing tensions here. But, as for Wicksell and Malthus, it was partly the sorts of books that were available in Sweden at the time, because in terms of publishing and what you could get, I don't think Malthus was available. They got a copy of Drysdale in English, and they read Drysdale in English. And that's sort of what spawned Wicksell's thinking originally, George Drysdale. And then from there, they went back and they started to get Malthus and Mill and some of these other people and piece it together. but a lot of what they did was translating some of this stuff into Swedish, right, for Swedish audiences, because it wasn't being done originally.
Thanks.
I think
I
there's
have
a
some
question in
questions
the
too.
chat. Oh, right here.
Or the person in the chat, if they'd like to go before me, that's fine.
You know, we'll put Rebecca in charge to decide.
Yeah, no, I don't see any question in the chat, but only to tell to the students, today is only 1 hour, so tomorrow we continue. So if you prefer to ask your questions tomorrow, you can also, today is only 1 hour webinar. Okay.
My question, Marianne, that was fascinating, by the way, so detailed in terms of the relationship between the political and social context and the emergence of economic thought. And I really found it interesting too how in the Swedish context, there wasn't any debate about whether this was an economic topic. Sorry if this is a bit confused, but perhaps it just comes out of real deep interest in what your talk is about, and some of the nuances and relationships between the British situation and also some other writings. So I had these questions. Did the Wickells engage with debates across the Channel in the UK? So you've had a look too at Maxime Montaigne's LSE thesis on how Malthusian thought was used by Charles Bradlaugh and Annie Besant in the case that gained a lot of attention in the UK. That was in 1877. So if he's writing in 1880, was he speaking to those debates too across the Channel? That's one question. And then the second question is, did the Wickells position themselves on the debates on the link between family immorality and poverty in the Lausanne school too? Because there seems to be two different ways of viewing the relationship between family immorality and poverty, and one's that family immorality produces poverty because families are responsible for their own poverty because of their bad decisions. And the other one is that it's actually family immorality is caused by drunkenness, prostitution, etc., is caused by poverty. And so he seems to be siding with that latter view, and that seems to be the view of Voras and not Pareto. Does he discuss the other studies of population in relation to family morality in Voras and Pareto as well, which were taking place at the same time? So those are my kind of two questions, which are purely selfish because I'm interested.
Those are great questions. It's very interesting. And it would be a good job for me to go back and read Wicksell's writings with an eye to Voras and Pareto, especially in the Lausanne school, to see, because a lot of times his population writings are meant for a more general audience. There's only maybe 5 that are really, I would say, academic. And so the ones that are meant for a general audience often talk about things, but they don't cite them, right? So you can't go through very quickly and follow who the influences are. So it'd be a good question to go back and look more carefully. With regards to the British, the Wickells in the 1880s and the 1890s, they're very oriented towards Scandinavia. So the conversation was very much with the Danish and the Swedes and the Norwegian. And the one sort of major outside influence was the French. And I don't know if it's just because they both read French better than English or German. Although Wicksell is pretty good at German. The French the use of earlier use of contraception, the population debates in France, and then some of the French writers were the ones that he talks about more.
Who in particular?
That's a very good question. I was just trying to think in my head without going over here to look for my file.
Sure. Because Voros talks about a group of writers, French writers, that he calls the French spiritualists.
Okay.
And they're the ones that are related to the that journal that was, oh geez, I'll have to go back to my notes too and have a look. But I think they included the same Baptiste. I'd have to double check.
Yeah.
But just, and they were for Voros, he thought that they were actually blaming families for their immorality, for their poverty, because it was their immorality and bad decisions that had caused their poverty. So it's, again, seems like he's a bit different to that.
This is a really interesting little a string, I think, to follow here.
Yeah.
Between Valras and the influence on Wicksell and the French.
And the other question that I had was, so Alfred Marshall, you know, when he deals with Malthus, it's kind of to show how Malthus was wrong and that, you know, population could increase much more than Malthus had anticipated with his account, with Malthus's account of the relationship between agricultural production and population growth. But it sounds like Wicksell's using Malthus in a non-critical way. Is that true? Do you think?
I think Wicksell accepted the premise, right, that the resources were constrained, not necessarily environmental resources, but agricultural productive resources and land resources were constrained, and they weren't going to grow as fast as the population would like to grow. So, and I don't know why he accepted that essentially uncritically, except that it's a piece of all of his work, and he never assumes that, you know, we can innovate our way out of the problem, right, with better technologies. He didn't think that, despite living through the Industrial Revolution, he didn't think that agricultural productivity was going to be that influenced by any sort of technological innovation. But maybe that's something we can discuss more after we hear about Marshall.
Yeah.
In 2 weeks, I think,
Maybe.
right?
Just over a week, I think.
Yeah.
I better get it finished.
I think that's one of the fun things about a webinar is you can be somewhat more speculative, and then you get some pushback and you're like, oh, I guess I can't say that, but maybe.
And we can continue the conversations in the other one. I don't know if there is any other question, anybody that wants to say something. Yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Again, I have very speculative question, thought, comments. The first one is just like, I have no idea when exactly demographer craft a sort of statistical theory about demographic transition that, I mean, I think it's in the 30s, but I'm not sure. And so I was wondering, basically Wicksell and in the Swedish context, what was the sort of state of data on population, and if there was like also purely, not purely because it's never purely statistical, but like basically discussion on numbers and on the causal analysis of some major shift. I'm saying that because I think in the US, for example, there is some debate on the rate of divorce and the causal effect of the increased education of women or other aspect and things like this. And so I think, yeah, those debates are theoretical, and also at the moment they're also gathering a lot of data. And so I was wondering Wicksell's use of data in general. And I was also, I had the same question about the engagement with other intellectuals on those questions, because I didn't know actually, and Buger, again, I don't know how you pronounce that. She's next to Millicent Fawcett in many pictures, but not many, like one picture I actually used. And so I remember I didn't make the relationship, even if there was Wicksell written next to her second name. So she was, I think, she interacted with sort of like international feminist organization. And I just wonder, can you tell us a little bit more of the relation between the two? Because it's interesting they later influenced the Myrdal, and as couples in sort of the history of ideas, it's really interesting. And I just wonder if this is a Swedish tradition or what. I mean, just, I would like to hear you a bit more about their collaboration. I also wanted to emphasize that this is the first point you're making about what is an economic problem in which context, especially historical period. I'm very much surprised, basically, that what were major economic problem at the time are not completely reflected in the history of those periods, but like, especially in the history of economics. So for example, I knew much more about Wicksell theory of monetary circle and what he would do on, I have absolutely no idea, the way I was taught history of economics, that he, first of all, seems to be a radical reformer, was also working on other issues. It may be due to what you mentioned at the end, like he published in pamphlets most of his thought on population rather than in theoretical paper. But also it was a major problems at the time of the time. So I wonder for the webinar more generally, I think this is also about like what our conception of economic problems is really an historical construct. And at the time, population was an obsession, and it was really, really at the center of those debates. And I think this is not completely present in the way we talk about this period. I'm talking end of the 19th century to the post-war period, and after, of course. So yeah, just my mumbling. Thanks.
That's a lot of interesting topics to take up. I think Wicksell on the data, it's pretty quick. They had the Swedes had a census, right, and they had some regular data collection for tax purposes. And in 1914, Wicksell actually goes into the data. We had for a couple of years been working in various government offices in collaboration. And so he uses the census data to sort of track population growth. And what he's looking at in particular is not divorce, but late marriages, because the Swedes had sort of developed this tradition over the last half century of very late marriage, meaning in the upper 20s or early 30s. And he's talking about how this, all by itself is going to reduce population growth. And it was driven primarily, right, by economic concerns that they couldn't afford to marry and set up a household before, many years of work and savings. But it's the 1914 paper it's very short, but it's quite interesting, this use of data. On Anna Wicksell, they met at an international feminist conference. She is actually Norwegian, Eventually, they set up house together, and she was a major contributor, right, to the Swedish feminist movement. She's one of the earliest women elected to city council. She found a loophole in the law that let women who owned property be able to vote in local elections that they named after her. And after World War I, she became a major figure for international peace. And she was a Swedish representative to the League of Nations on several committees. And so that's probably where we get the photos of her with a lot of the other leading international feminists of the period. And she traveled widely to the United States, to England, throughout Europe, as sort of Sweden's peace ambassador in the 1920s. We could talk about her all day, but probably we shouldn't.
So I think we can stop here and we continue in the next webinar.
Yeah.
So next webinar will be Marianne Bankowski.
Yeah.
Next Tuesday. That's it. Super. And
Yep.
for students, see you tomorrow. Thank you very much, Marianne.
Thank you. I really appreciate all the comments and very insightful questions. She'll keep me busy for quite a while. Thank you.
Bye.